This is Diana Sullivan in Austin, Texas. I'm doing some machine knitting ribber lessons, and this is going to be the first cast-off lesson. I have some 1x1 ribbing here. In fact, I've dropped this front bed so that you could get a good look at what this actually is. This is a 1x1 needle arrangement, and I need to bind it off. So let me pop this rubber bed up and talk about the two loop-through-a-loop bind-offs that you do in ribbing. One is on the machine and the other is off the machine. This is a good situation for an on-the-machine loop-through-loop bind-off, and I'll tell you why. On the machine is a good way to do a bind-off if you can transfer all the stitches up to the main bed without having to put two stitches on one main bed needle. And since this is 1x1 ribbing, that's no problem. I can transfer this stitch onto this needle and so forth, so that every stitch will have its own needle. With this loop-through-a-loop bind-off on the machine, I want to have the opportunity to bind off each stitch individually. Stitches that are doubled up do not look the same at all when they're bound off, and I prefer the look of stitches that are bound off individually. Now I'm going to show next, after this lesson, an off the machine loop-through-a-loop bind off that you can use for situations where you really can't get them all up onto the main bed. For instance, full needle rib, or for instance, the very springy 2x2 ribbing that I showed in an earlier lesson. It's not practical for this bind-off. It just isn't going to look as good. Now the first step with this bind-off is to knit the final row. I call it the last loose row. Knit the final row of the ribbing much looser than the rest of it. My carriages were set on 3, and I'm going to loosen them all the way up to 7 in a click. Now I strongly urge you to work a sample with the same yarn that you are using for your garment and the same tension to make sure that you like the effect with the tension that you choose for your loose tension. Remember that on some machines there are less tension numbers on the ribber than there are in the main bed. In that case, you can certainly set this to its loosest tension. Set this to its loosest tension, even if it's a couple of whole numbers bigger, because on this 1x1 ribbing, whatever extra looseness there is will travel between the stitches, and it'll come out looking even anyway. But for my example, I'm going to use this 7 in a click for each of the beds for the tension. And now I'm knitting my last loose row. Now that I have my last loose row knitted, I need to transfer my stitches up to the main bed, and I'm doing it with this double-eyed needle that comes with the machine. And it's a transfer tool for going from ribbing to the main bed. This is a very easy and secure way to transfer stitches. It is by no means the only method to transfer stitches. So let me go ahead and finish transferring every stitch across the row off camera, and then I'll show you the next step. My stitches are all transferred to the main bed. I've dropped the ribber, and I'm going to put on my nifty ribber covers. Gosh, when I use these ribber covers, I'm keeping all kinds of little hooks and pegs that protrude and could catch my yarn. I'm keeping them all out of my way, so whenever I want to do something hand manipulated and I don't want the ribber to have all these little places to catch the yarn, I like to do that. Then I'm just going to cut the yarn over here and zoom in on this right end and show how I do the loop-through-a-loop transfers. I'm taking the weights off, and after I get the weights off, I'm going to take the comb off, because the weights in the comb are just too much weight on this knitting for the loop-through-the-loop bind-off. So I'm getting all of this off, and I'm going to hang one claw weight kind of close to where I'm working, and that's going to be enough weight for what I'm doing. The next thing I do is I get the needle pusher and I bring the stitches all the way out to hold position. The needles are out, pushing the stitches back behind the latches. And I've cut the yarn on the left end. On the right end, I have the latch tool and I'm going to catch the first loop. Now I go and catch the second loop and I adjust my tool so that the first loop's behind the latch, the second loop is inside the latch, and I pull one through the other and I just work my way across. You can get fast at this. This is identical to the loop through a loop bind off that I did in the beginner lessons. The only difference is that I had to move the stitches up from the ribber to the main bed. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this off camera and then show it to you so you can see exactly what this edge looks like. I have this sample and I'm just going to poke it on the gag pegs, which you would never do in real life, just so I could show you the edges. This is the cast-on edges, and it's a typical circular cast-on edge. You've seen it many times now. This is the bound-off edge. It looks like a chain when you look down at it from the very edge. It is a nice, tidy edge. I think it would be perfectly acceptable on a neckline. Of course, the neckline is usually the most visible part of a garment, so you need a really good-looking bind-off. And here's a really good-looking bind-off. Now, how tight or loose this is depends on how tight or loose I set the tension on the final loose row. So, if that last loose row is too tight, this is really going to draw in and be very tight. You might want it to draw in. If it's looser, you'll get a different effect. So you should practice this with the yarn that you're going to use for the garment. So this is the first bind off. It is the loop through a loop bind off, and there are several others, and I really hope that you will try them all. This loop through a loop bind off is a good bind off, but is not necessarily the best bind off for every situation. So next I'm going to show the loop through a loop bind off the machine. This was the loop through a loop ribbing bind off on the machine. I would like to mention that this is exactly the same bind off you get if you're a hand knitter and you follow most hand knitting directions, where you bind off the last row, knitting the knits and purling the purls. That's what we did with the machine. So the loop through a loop bind off on the machine. Hope you'll practice that. And next lesson is going to be the loop through a loop bind off the machine.